Hi, I'm Colin, and today I'd like to share some ideas on the future of drone warfare. Now, drones could be a major game changer in warfare, but it's not just the technology, but it's also the concept of how they're used, which is very important. To explain this fully, let me draw a couple of historical parallels. Prior to World War One, the advantage was very much with the attacker. Warfare was very mobile, you had cavalry charges, everything was very quick. But in World War One, that changed with people in trenches and guns. If you charge at someone in a trench with a gun, they're going to shoot you. It's the advantage with the defender. Now, the answer to this was the tank. The tank could go over the top of trenches with the person inside relatively unharmed. So, the tank was the answer, but it wasn't used in the right way. Initially, they were used individually. It was only when they started being used in large numbers together that they were effective, backed up by infantry and aircraft. It was then that World War One was won. Now, let's look at a second parallel. In the Cold War, the Russians had a big advantage in land forces and tanks in Europe. The West's answer was air superiority, that they could deal a quick knockout blow. But that would only work if the airfields were operational. All the Russians had to do was knock out the airfields, and then they would win the entire war. So the West started looking at modular standoff weapons. These would be aerial attack vehicles that were not reliant on airfields. Now, these were the early forerunners of drones, and at that time, in about 1986, I had discussions with various people in the defense industry, and I drew up some pictures of what drones would look like. Now, drones do actually look very similar to my original drawings today, probably just a coincidence. But this was the concept of where drone technology can go. And although the drones are there still today, they are not being used to their full potential. Drones are still being held back by some very old-fashioned thinking. We're still thinking about big things that people need to sit in, which don't apply anymore. We're also thinking about indiscriminate warfare with conventional heavy weapons. Now, these days, warfare is much more likely to be much more local, asymmetric, and against insurgents. Now, if there's an insurgency, there could just be a few people in a town causing the problems. You don't bomb them from the air. That is the most ineffective thing because it's just going to drive more people towards the insurgency. Drones have the advantage that they're very small, can act very locally, and this is what's going to be most valuable about them. I'd heard that a Predator drone takes 180 people to manage it. Now, I can imagine what a couple of people would do, but really, so many people, this rather defeats the object of what a drone is. A drone should be something very efficient and get away from all of this heavy support in the original vision of the modular standoff weapon. So, what is the solution to this? Well, drones can be very cheap these days. You can buy a commercial drone for $20 or $30, and it doesn't need much modification to be an effective weapon. So, instead of using million-dollar drones, imagine using thousands, swarms of cheap drones all connected up together, and this would be very, very difficult to defend against. Imagine trying to knock those out the sky with million-dollar missiles. How many million-dollar missiles could you afford? So, what kind of weapons could a drone carry? Well, the simplest would be an explosive. Think of it as an autonomous, let's say, grenade that can fly around right to its target. Another one could be a type of gun. Now, recoil would knock a regular small drone out of the sky, so you'd have to be a little bit smart about how you are attaching one of those. Now, drones can be used in large numbers, in swarms. How would they be controlled? Well, this would need to be at a number of levels, so you'd have them integrated with each other. You'd have some up in the sky, observing what's going on and directing others towards targets. You could have others much closer to the targets, either observing as well, let's say within buildings, or carrying weapons and carrying out attacks. Now, the disadvantage, if you have a bunch of network drones together, the more complex the system, the more susceptible it is to, let's say, an EMP attack. So you'd need a couple of levels of different controls. You would need an integrated computer system guiding them all together. You would also need a certain amount of autonomy, that they would continue flying and not just drop out of the sky when they're attacked, and as a backup, also human control over radio control. So between all three of these, you've got some mutual redundancy within the system. Now imagine how you could use drones in a defensive situation. For example, you have a village on the border and you're expecting it to come out under attack. The civilians have already been cleared from the area, so you want a defensive action from drones. Now a lot of these could be fixed in place, and they are already proving to be quite effective in kind of booby traps. If you look at what's happening in Syria at the moment, the majority of Syrian army casualties aren't coming from the attacks, they're coming from trying to clear liberated villages from booby traps. Now, imagine a conventional force and a conventional army using this to its full potential. They would have, let's say, sniper positions embedded high up in buildings as drones operated remotely. And they would have other drones flying around. Basically, anything that moves into that zone would become a target. It would be a kill zone. So in terms of defensive, this is moving an advantage back to the defenders. Now let's think about how drones could be used on the offensive. Now, they have an advantage here as well. So for example, they could go behind enemy lines even at night time, and using a combination of different zones, some as observers, others going up carrying out very, very pinpointed attacks. So for example, if there was an infantry position, it could go up very, very close without any civilian casualties. If there was something larger like a tank, it could then call in resources from conventional weapons, for example an airstrike or an artillery strike. So there could be also, let's say, mobile snipers, so anything that was then moving within that zone that was military could be shot at. Now let's think about how drones could be applied in naval warfare. Now again, let's stop thinking about big battleships carrying people and think much, much smaller. Drones are much more similar in concept to something like an autonomous mine or even a torpedo by itself. And why continue making things out of metal? It corrodes heavily in the sea. Plastic would be far better and undetectable. So you'd have an undetectable mobile mine that would get very close to ships. How could the ship electronically differentiate between it and a fish? So you see that even though drones already exist and are being used in a limited extent in warfare, they haven't been properly thought through what the concept is, similar to the way when tanks were first invented. So, drones can and will be used significantly more in warfare in the future, but it really has to be completely rethought, the concept of how it's done.